Well, welcome everybody to the Ministering Through Church Gardening webinar. I'm very excited about this. I like to garden, and I'm sure that everybody that's on this call is as well. I'm really excited to listen to a group of other people talk about their passion for gardening, our shared passion for gardening. I really like to think that, God intends for us to kind of get in the ground and garden and grow our food, and I think it's healthy and all those things. And I always feel closer to God while I'm in my garden, and I hope that's true for everybody on this call as well. And it really struck me that, I've been thinking lately about my church has a little bit of extra grass, and thinking about whether or not it would be good to garden that and find ways to share it with the community. So I'm excited to learn about this as much as everybody else. So I'll say a quick prayer before we get started, and then we can get started. God, thank you for giving us your earth to take care of, and thank you for giving us wisdom and guiding us as we do. Thank you for being a God who loves every creature, the worms and the bugs in the soil that help make everything work, and all the fruit that we grow. And I pray that you'll help everybody on this call learn about ways that they can use their garden, their church garden, to minister. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Well, we're going to get started today with my friend Beth Bukowski. She is actually a librarian and works for a state library, but as she said to me earlier, her craft doesn't have anything to do with her hobby. And so I'm excited to see this part of Beth and talk a little bit about how she's ministered through gardening in her community. So take it away, Beth.
Okay. So when I joined my first community garden in 2012 when I moved to a new neighborhood, and I didn't have any space to really do anything. And Cleveland has a program that's run in part with the Ohio State University, where they have an urban gardening program. And the city they actually provide seeds and some plants, and they do workshops, and it's a really incredible thing because there's all of these free resources, and Cleveland's a very economically depressed and very segregated city, and it's one of those things that does bring people together because these are all over the city. There's a big meeting at the beginning of the year where you're drinking coffee with people who live halfway across town and saying, hey, what are you growing, and what are you having problems with? And sometimes you end up trading plants or getting people's phone numbers and keeping in touch with them. So I found that was a really good way to get to know my neighbors. It brought a lot of people, no pun intended, but there was common ground there. Like, we came from very different backgrounds. We had, as far as socioeconomic and ethnic, and so I got to meet a really interesting cross section of my neighbors and build relationships with them in a way that I probably wouldn't have. There hadn't been that space that was available for us. So I've since moved, and I'm in a new neighborhood where there's the Methodist church at the end of my street has a community plot, and they started a community garden that's hooked up with the city now, but they use several of the beds to grow food for their neighbors and for their community meals that they have. And some of the people there actually hang out and invite people down to have fellowship in the garden. And they give away things to people passing by if they just happen to strike up a conversation. And it's a really good thing, and it's really helped connect with the neighborhood. And my neighborhood also has a lot of Nepali refugees in it. So we have, I realized I haven't shown pictures of anything, but a lot of them came over here 10 years ago, They've been kicked out of Bhutan during an ethnic cleansing program. And they got kicked out of the kingdom that describes itself as the happiest place on earth, and they ended up in Cleveland, which was known as got rated the most miserable city in America a few years ago. But they've found community here, so now I'm meeting new neighbors, and there's a language barrier and a cultural barrier, but it's given me a chance to learn about how they do things, because they've used the same tiny plots back home and here to feed their families. And I'm going to try to share my screen here. And so I got to finally ask, how do you do, how do you do what you need, what you're doing? How do you make it work? So give me a second here. This is awkward. But this is what my next door neighbor's plot looks like. They put these fences around the outside, and they built a little shelter. This is an old mattress on top. There's some scarecrows, and they plant their beans and their corn along the edges. They build these fences out of sticks and things that have been picked up off the curb. It amazes me that they do so much with so little. And they're growing cilantro and peppers and potatoes and a lot of greens. And they get some horse manure for free to enrich the soil from a farm up the road. And so there's a little awkward social dynamics there between the people who are already in the neighborhood and their new neighbors. But it's been trying to find ways to connect and with my new neighbors too, who've actually been in the garden 8 years longer than I have. So, but I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything along those lines.
I forgot to mention earlier, we'll have questions at the end.
Okay.
I know, Beth, you talked about, I believe it was a Methodist church in your neighborhood that has a community garden. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's, hold on here. So this is the community garden that the Methodist Church has. It's founded, and it's got raised beds, and this welcome sign is one of them. The first, I think, 4 or 5 are the ones that they maintain. I think their youth group does work with it. There's one guy, Roy, who's the church organist, and he coordinates a lot of that. And his sister's actually a master gardener, so she's usually out there showing us how to do things better. And so it's hooked up with the city now, but they were the ones who got it going, and it's been there, I think, for about 20 years or so.
Wow.
So and they get several pounds of Swiss chard every year, and they're constantly just very generous with a lot of it. Here's their sign from I'm not good at screen sharing. I'm sorry, everyone. But they've had these signs up in the neighborhood, and along with giving away food. So there's another shot of that one. I'm actually kind of in double membership. The one where most of my neighbors are Nepali is I was actually on a waiting list to join that one.
Great. Well, thank you, Beth. I enjoyed hearing about how you got to know some of your neighbors through the garden, and also learning about people from around the world that were brought to you through your garden. And so I think that's a really neat story. Next, we're going to hear from a master gardener. We have Claire Hescox, who is lives in Pennsylvania, and she's a master gardener certified by Penn State. And I'm excited to hear a little bit more about master gardening.
Well, Master Gardening is really a wonderful program, and there's several states that have Master Gardening programs through one of their universities and their College of Agriculture. And what you learn the most when you begin your journey as a Master Gardener is how much you don't know and how much you thought you knew, but then you get into the really nuts and bolts of all kinds of botany and trees and soil, and the education opportunities are awesome. And we have this wonderful, I like to share this wonderful textbook that we have. This is what we get as a Master Gardener and take the course, and it lasts a whole semester. It's free, you just have to buy the book. And all the lectures are done by people who are authorities in their fields, and it's just been a wonderful experience for me. And then I've learned so much about the environment through Master Gardening. Like, one of the first steps that we would encourage anybody to do is to plant native plants that are indigenous to your state, because it supports the microbiological levels of all of your plantings, from the micro all the way up to trees. And when you do that, you're more successful because those plants can tolerate your climate. They also support the bugs and the insects and the birds along with that. And 97% of all birds need to feed their young with insects. You can put out your bird feeders, and that's awesome for the adult birds, but the baby birds cannot eat the bird food that we put out in our bird feeders. They need the insects. So that's a one of the wonderful reasons to plant native plants. Also, as birds and insects and butterflies migrate in their seasonal migrations, they stop at certain places along their routes to feed on the natural insects that will get them to the next level of their migration. So it's crucial for them to have enough food to make their migration routes. So that's another reason why we encourage native plants. When I talk to anyone, I've talked to a few groups. One was my church group. Whenever you're starting a garden, you always want to consider the exposure to the sun, where it is, how long you have morning and afternoon and evening sun, and place plants that tolerate that level of sunlight in those areas so that they'll be more successful. One of the lectures that was offered to the Master Gardeners that I was completely uneducated about is on soil. And soil is not dirt, and it's different, and it's extremely active and full of microorganisms that are healthy for the plantings and the success of your gardens. And so that was another thing that's offered as part of our continuing education as Master Gardeners. It's built into the program. So I've learned a lot. And the other thing I've recommended that all gardeners do, if you can, is keep a journal of what you did this year and what worked, what didn't work, what you want to try new, that kind of thing. Because then I feel like if, it may not be your thing, and maybe some people aren't into journaling those things, but I think if you are invested in gardening, and that would really help guide you to keep you because I forget from year to year, what did I plant? I don't remember. I think they look nice and they tasted good, but I can't remember everything. So I always ask that, I always, suggest that people do that. And we also recommend that you get your soil tested at your local extension service in the fall. For whatever reasons that escape me right now, they recommend it in the fall as opposed to in the spring, to find out what your pH levels are, what you may be deficient in, what you may need to neutralize. So that's usually about an $8 or $9 fee to have your soil tested at your extension service office. They also offer kits that if you call your extension service and say, I need a soil testing kit, they will mail you one out, and then you send it to the laboratories that they have provided. There is, in most Master Gardener groups, there are hotlines, and you can call the Master Gardening Hotline, the Pennsylvania Extension Service hotline, and they will answer any questions. There's people that volunteer 4-hour time frames, and that's all they do is answer your questions. And what bug is this? Why is this leaf yellow? Why is this leaf, curling up on me? All those questions that you run into when you're trying something new, or even in a new garden, like you moved, like Beth did, and now you have a new area, and you may be exposed to different things. So that's a wonderful service, and all of this is volunteer. It's all community service, and that's what I liked about it, because I'm in my retirement years, I want to have something like that to really meet people and keep active and be engaged. So another thing that I always encourage people that ask me about gardening is make sure you clean your tools. We don't usually think about that, but if you do a 50-50 bleach and water mixture and you clean your tools, you're going to prevent a lot of the spread of possible microorganisms that you don't want. So that's another little tip that I always like to pass on, is to make sure that you clean your tools, and before you put them away for the year, that you clean them, oil them, so that they're ready for the next spring. And you're going to, be ready and raring to go. If you're like me in March, you've got the heebie-jeebies and you want to start your garden. So, if you are interested in the Master Gardener program in your area, you can always Google, the Master Gardener program in whatever state you're in, and then go from there. But I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I highly recommend it for anyone who's looking forward to that kind of an interaction.
Thank you, Claire. I took notes and I saw other people taking notes. That was informational. I was even laughing with my husband last night about the fact that we live with my parents, now multi-generational home, and my dad likes to clean the tools, and I never understood why. So for giving some new information. So
yeah.
Lastly, today, before we have question and answer, we have Cheryl Ice, who lives in Washington and runs a church garden and has a lot of great advice about things to think about when you're starting up your garden, a lot of practical tips. So go ahead, Cheryl.
Thanks, Kim. I was super excited when I saw Kim post about this webinar, because the name of it, ministering to your community through a community garden or through a church garden, is really kind of one of my passions. This year, actually October of last year, we started our first community garden at our church. But this garden was about 8 years in the making, because of like the processes that have to happen in order to get to a place where you can actually plant a garden. One of the things that I was talking to Kim about is you can't just go out and take a plot of land and plant a garden if your vision is to minister then in your community. Because a lot of times if you're operating on your own understanding about what's going on around you, you may not be doing what is really beneficial for those that live in your community. Last summer, we had the opportunity to minister to 15 families living below the poverty line. And one of the things that became very apparent to us was their inability to obtain fresh fruits and vegetables. They are on limited SNAP benefits, food stamps, depends on where you are in the country, but they're on limited food assistance, and vegetables, fresh vegetables in the grocery store are expensive. They're hard. It's hard to find organic versus, standard grown fruits and vegetables. Yet we are telling these families, well, your kids are struggling in school. Well, of course, because they're eating boxed macaroni and cheese and fruit snacks. They're not eating fresh fruits and vegetables, and they're not eating fresh fruit, and a lot of the stuff is prepackaged. So we started kind of talking to the parents about how could we best help you? What would be the best thing that we could be able to do to help meet the need that you have, and be able to be in that process. So our vision became an opportunity for us to grow fresh fruits and vegetables for the people living below the poverty level in our community. Now, even though we live in Puyallup is a suburban area, it is well known for its valley soil. It is the riverbed of the Puyallup River, which is one of the major rivers in our area. The soil is amazing. It is fertile. It is loamy. It grows really well. And there's farmers that live all around the suburban area, but they do not donate their good fruits and vegetables to people in need. Whatever is left over or maybe on the verge of going bad, they give it to the food bank. And of course, then by the time somebody in need gets it, it's half rotten, it's crappy. Well, last summer we had one lady who grew tomatoes for our families. And so we would give them bags of tomatoes every, oh wait, sorry, my dogs are barking. So one of the advantages of working from home, you get to love my dogs as much as I do. But so we did, we gave them fresh tomatoes, and they thought that was like you were giving them gold. They felt loved and cared for in a way that only Christ could do that, right? So as we're talking about ministering in our community, we are loving them as Christ has loved us. And so that spurred us along to this idea of, well, how could we grow more fruits and vegetables for those individuals? And as we prayed about it and as we thought about it, it also became, how do we reach the people in our community with Christ, right? We started talking about that. And we live in a community where people are very kind. They're very kind and they're very helpful, but that doesn't necessarily correlate to being a Christ follower. And we have a lot of people in our community that would never, ever, ever set foot inside a church. And so then we said, how do we take what they love is helping people, meeting the needs of people who are struggling, with what Christ has called us to do? And so we have opened up our community garden into the community as well. People who don't know Christ have been invited to come and participate with us. People that live in the community are now participating in the community garden. The idea being is that as Christ followers, we are ministering when we are showing our love to the people that are in need, but also to our love to the people in our own community. And so it's kind of a two-part thing. We have set it up and the majority of it to grow fresh fruits and vegetables for the people in need of food in our community. But the undercurrent of all of it is, how do we engage our community in Christ's love to minister in a way that is Christ-like, not just preaching to them about their salvation, preaching, but actually living Christ-like lives in front of them. So that's kind of the premise behind it. We kind of call it a community on mission. The idea being that there's a core group of people from the church that is the core of the community. And we have meetings with that core group of people. There's about 15 of us. And we pray for the people that we're giving the food to. We pray over the food. We have conversations about what does it mean to be, Christ-like. But then it's also us loving the people who come to the garden that don't know Christ, and loving them without expectation, loving them without saying, well, you can come and participate in the garden if you join the church, or you can come and do this if you come to this church service first, right? We've kind of totally separated that. So we're just letting them be who they are and letting God do the work in their own hearts. Okay. So that's how we're ministering to the community through our community garden. That takes a lot of pre-work before you get to the actual having a garden. You have to be able to know who's in your community. You have to be able to ask questions. So some of the things that have happened in the last year is we've partnered with a local school. Now in the spring, they have kindergarten through third graders that will be planting seeds in their classrooms that we will then plant in our community garden. The kindergarten through third graders will come down from the school. They'll bring us their seeds and they'll help us plant them in an event in the garden. We've also partnered with this same school to bring the sixth graders in to do community service in the community garden. Well, that same food then is being feeding some of their families. So not only are they participating in growing food, but they're also seeing how Christ's love then loves them. So that's kind of like how that part works. When you know what's going on in your community, when you know the need and not just what you assume, then you can begin to build your garden around that. So I have a video I'm going to share. The first video, actually I have two. The first video I'm going to share is kind of how we started. We are fortunate enough to have some extra space on our church property. One of those spaces is behind a house that we use for classrooms. When we first started, it was overgrown with blackberries, dead bushes, and I don't have the very, very beginning because before I could get down there to take pictures, the person who volunteered to do the stuff with the bobcat had already done all of his work. So you're going to see the piles of bushes and the people that are working in the garden, but know that all of the stuff that's in the center of this space was all around the edges, blackberries, dead bushes, everything. In fact, the area hadn't been even touched in about 5 years. And so we chose this area, and I'm going to share it. I'm going to let you watch the video and then I'll tell you a little bit more about it. I don't want to talk over the audio. It's just music, but it's too hard. So as you can see there at the end, it was all cleared out. We took 5 tons of dirt, debris, branches, dead trees out of that backyard in the course of about, it took us about 2 months. Here we are pulling the sod up for the garden beds. And so I'm gonna change here real quick to show you what it looked, well, this was in May, so right now it looks actually way better because everything's kind of grown, but this was it middle of May. So from October of last year until now, we have 9 full beds. We opted to do half raised beds and half in-ground beds. We do have seniors that come in and work in the garden. They work really well in the raised beds. They don't do so well in the in-ground beds. This summer, we're building 9 more beds that will be rented out to people in the community to grow their own food. This fall, we will start teaching classes to people to learn to grow their own food, to grow, whether they're doing small pots on their backyard or they're going to come into the garden. But it really is about meeting the need, educating people, and loving them right where they are anyway. We have, this year, we opted for specific vegetables that are either cut and come again or produce multiple harvests throughout the summer. We didn't opt for any potatoes. We did plant onions because somebody gave me 4 flats of Walla Walla sweet onions starts. So they went in the ground. We had set aside money to start the garden last summer. The reality is we haven't had hardly used any of it because people are so excited and engaged that they're just donating to the garden, whether they donate the Bobcat, the use of the Bobcat, their time. We have somebody who came in and put in a sprinkler system so we don't have to hand water everything. That, I mean, they paid for the materials to do that. The only thing we've had to buy is soil and compost for the beds and for the in-ground, just to kind of revitalize it just a little bit this spring, and the wood chips. Although now I have found a location that will give me free wood chips whenever I want them. So, eventually it's not costing us anything. So I still, not only do I have the money that we set aside, I have money that we raised this year from our plant sale. We raised almost $2,000 from our first plant sale of the year, which was just kind of a haphazard thing that we threw together. Next year will be a little more organized, but even to that, somebody donated 100 1-gallon perennials for us to sell, which we couldn't have, we wouldn't have had if they hadn't donated them. So, and we grew lots of vegetables, seeds and everything. So, and then the last thing that I would say is, if you're interested in doing a community garden at your church, go around and talk to the people who have started the community garden in other churches around you. We probably spent 4 months talking to every community garden that had been started in not just our county, but in the area kind of around the county, because we wanted to know what wouldn't they do again. We wanted to know what mistakes they made. And so honestly, we have been incredibly successful this year by just asking them what they wouldn't do. So we're super excited that God's just kind of working in this, and he has made it entirely possible for us to bless the community in such a way that we just get to be Christ to people. So anyway.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. I like that you talk about starting with the community in mind, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. There are so many other things to think about, but I think that's really important when you're trying to use it as a ministry. We'll turn now to questions, and we have one in the question and answer in the chat. If anybody has any more questions, you can type it in, or I can call on people. First, Teresa asked, how much is the rent of the beds? And I know Cheryl mentioned that that you're going to rent beds next year, but Beth might also have an answer, and maybe Claire as well. So how much are you going to rent your beds for, Cheryl?
We have opted to do them for $25, which from my research is actually probably lower than a lot of places around us. But because I don't need it to maintain the bed, I am just using it to offset the water costs.
Okay. Beth, how much do you pay in Cleveland?
I pay, last year was 15, now it's 18. And then the larger plot, which is about two or three times as big, it's about 50 by 30 feet. I split that with a friend, and it was 28.
Okay. Claire, do you know about the community gardens in your area?
No, unfortunately, the gardens that we maintain as master gardeners are at a couple of the state parks, and we have a section of 3 or 4 acres where we grow anything from blueberries to blackberries to annuals to zinnias to vegetables to asparagus, potatoes, sweet potatoes, onions. And when we harvest all that, we give it to the local food bank that sell it. And each week, when in the fall, as things start to come into season and we harvest them all, we keep a record of it, and it's a couple thousands of pounds of fresh fruits and vegetables. And so that goes directly to our community service in York, Pennsylvania, right in the city of York.
Okay, great, thank you. Judith, I see that you have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I thought it'd be easier since there's a nice small group, so I'll talk. So, Beth, I'm curious. You said that there was a lot of ethical groups and stuff like, mix.
Mm-hmm.
Have you sort of thought about, what food they ethically eat? Does that influence what you grow?
I think I was already kind of cooking that way because I've been so used to, like, my neighborhood has a lot of East African, Puerto Rican, Nepali, and folks from the Middle East. So that's like my local grocery store is a lot of those shops. So it's definitely influenced how I eat. And then also seeing how they do their companion planting and how they arrange things has kind of inspired me. And I haven't actually attempted some of the things this year, but I'm planning to next year.
Okay, thank you. And Cheryl, I was going to ask you, one of the things that I think about with my church there, they're wanting me to start moving on a committee and stuff like this. One of the thoughts I had is that our church is not doing well financially. We've lost a lot of people died last year, and we're already a small church. And so a lot of major people have gone. And a lot of elderly congregation. I'm conscious of trying to recommend that we grow more flowers because it becomes very expensive to buy. So perhaps if we grow more for the church. But at the end of the day, there hasn't been talk about how to bring the community in. So I like what you've been sort of saying in getting to know your community and how to deal with that. So I then switch to another church. I've got two churches that I'm going to could be working with. One is in downtown Toronto. I live in Canada. One is in downtown Toronto. They're next to a hospital. They have really bad problems with drugs in the area, and using their particular church is sort of in the middle of a very dense buildup. So there's the green area. So, I mean, vegetables is obviously one thing. I was thinking again of flowers because of bringing the hospital people in who come from the hospital. It's people who are serious and really go to this hospital are seriously ill. But with the down and outs, but what they're trying to do is I don't know how much in the sense of a garden or how you go about it with your experience, you know, because you have to know the user. So every church has got different users. Mm-hmm. So, you know, when you start looking at these kind of varieties, I should say, in trying to do a garden, I do think it's good because they are very low income. And as you sort of say, they need fresh vegetables. So when you talk about ministry and like, I want to bring in, you know, God to the picture. And I like the fact that you sort of said, if you're outside in the garden, and because that's people shy, I think that's relative to this particular church. So in working with the church, how would you suggest I start the conversation with them?
Starting the conversation with the church about it?
Yeah.
Well, so one of the things that I really think that you and the church probably would need to talk about is, what do you want to accomplish with the garden? You know, and then when you can clearly articulate what you want to accomplish, what your mission is, your vision, how would it benefit the church, right? So at the end of the day, every church has a board, and the board looks at things and goes, this is going to benefit me, or this isn't going to benefit me, right, wrong, or indifferent. That's kind of how we operate in the church, right? So what is it that this garden will do for the church, for that church specifically, but also maybe thinking about what will it do for the church as a whole? Not just, you know, Our Lady, Queen of Heaven, right? But the whole kingdom, and really be able to articulate that part well. For us, it is about reaching the least and the lost, about in a way that is not about having them be in the church. And so what we have, one of the things that you then have to be able to articulate to them is, how does it then begin to transition from just being a fun place to go to being something that actually then is ministering to them. And one of the things is that you have to be clear about how, how they are envisioning their evangelism. In our church, in our community, I live in an area where there are 28 churches within a 5 square mile area. So for me, it is about being Christ like to those people, loving the unlovable, loving those that the rest of the community may have cast aside. And in doing that, they are experiencing Christ. And then it also helps me to know that I'm not changing anybody's mind about who Christ is. I'm just loving them where they are, and Christ changes their minds. And so when I sold it to the church board, I said, this gives us an opportunity to get outside of the four walls of this church, to get our butts out of the pews, to be out, not only doing, working in the garden where God has had us, but also loving people the way Christ wants us to love people. And so, as you're talking to this church, what I would recommend, this is just me, and I don't know the whole situation, and I'd love to talk to you more about it, but it has to all come back to Christ. It all has to come back to being Christ-centered in what you're doing. And just no, I'm not trying to be disrespectful or anything, but just growing flowers for the hospital isn't really showing somebody who Christ is. But having them in the garden and saying, hey, can I pray for you? How can I pray for you? Or taking the flowers to someone in need or in sickness or, in somewhere, and saying, how can I pray for you? Is there anything else I can do for you? Right. Loving them through the garden is, that would be the idea of how I would sell that to the church. Sorry to be long-winded.
That's okay. Thank you, Cheryl. I know John also has his hand raised. Do you have a question, John?
Actually, I have a couple questions, but first one is again towards Cheryl. I saw that you had some really wonderful sort of containers there. They were the kind of the silver containers, and we're very blessed. We have a very nice raised bed garden for our church. We have a master gardener that's running that. But I was thinking for a lot of smaller churches or churches without a lot of space, or that can't get a hold of a rototiller or a lot of, I thought those would be really good. Can you tell me a little bit about those containers?
They are your standard horse water troughs. The only reason that we're using them in that space is they have raspberries in them. And if you've ever grown raspberries, they're incredibly invasive if they're in the ground. Even in a raised bed, they will be everywhere. So we put them in the raised containers, and we put mesh on the bottom. So even though we drilled the holes for water to drain, the roots really are going to have a hard time getting out of that container. And so the idea is that we'll have raspberries, but they will be contained. So they're just standard horse watering troughs. We got the 3-foot variety. I've seen people who get the full 6-foot ones, and they grow everything in them. I mean, they're 3 feet wide, and they're great. So,
John, what was your next question?
Oh, and my other question is anybody doing like on-site composting?
And this could be, any of the participants as well, if you actually have started your church garden. I'm excited. I just started a compost pile in my backyard for the first time after thinking about it forever. So, but is anybody doing it related to a church or community garden?
Well, we have one in our backyard, and we have one that's multi-level for composting. And you can start out, you have like a 3-step composting system. And when I was taking the Master Gardener course, that was my 15-minute presentation at the end of the course, was on proper composting. And so you want to start with maybe 2 to start out, using your grass cuttings and leaves and browns, and then the fresh raw produce that you don't use, that the ends and the raw and then, you know, continually add and stir and add water. And there's a whole book on composting and successful composting, because that involves a lot of microorganisms breaking down and heating up, and it's really wonderful. It's an amazing thing. So there's a lot online, there's a lot on YouTube, there's a lot that churches and other organizations can benefit from by looking up how to start your first composting.
Great, thank you. Stephanie, I see you have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. So first of all, I just love this. This is the coolest thing. And then I also wanted to introduce myself to Cheryl, because Cheryl, I live in Bremerton,
Awesome.
just super close to you. And yeah, I really would love to connect, because I am trying to start a church garden in our church right now. So yeah, I just hear I really want to get started, but I'm like, I really need more information, and like things like this are really helping. But one question I had was kind of like, how do you guys distribute your food? I know that you guys are like just starting. So I don't know if you'll even have an answer to this, but maybe for other people too, like how the food is given, because you mentioned when you give it to the food banks, it might spoil before it gets given out.
So we're not, our intent is not to give it to any food banks. Not that food banks are bad, but they don't necessarily, we've put a lot of care and love into this food, and we want it to be cared for on the other end. And so we will be giving directly to families we've partnered with in the school district, as well as we have a group of seniors that are also living below the poverty line. But anything that is extra, we have partnered with an organization here in our county called Food is Free. It's a nonprofit in Pierce County, where I live, that has free food tables in. So there's 5 of these free food tables directly around our church. And what they are tables that have like coolers and refrigerators and all of these things that people just give food away. And so people come and can get fresh food every day. So that's kind of how we're hoping to be able to distribute it. And then the last place is, if I had to, we have a partnership with Salvation Army Food Bank right up the street from us. They go to, and the reason we are considering giving anything extra to them is because they have a mobile food bank that goes into places like, we have a Hispanic community down by the river. They go right to them because a lot of the Hispanic community is fearful of coming into the city. So we've been very deliberate about where we give the food to make sure that it's being loved and cared for all the way through the process.
Cool.
That's a good question. And I also think it probably depends a lot on what you've decided to do with your ministry. So thank you for sharing about what you did with your Cheryl. Does anybody else have any questions?
I have one for Cheryl. So one of the things I've noticed, because I've been in 3 different community gardens now, is that the first one, and this actually reminded me of what Judith was talking about, because that was in a neighborhood where there were a lot of down and out folks and a lot of different people. And obviously it wasn't a church garden. That was the only one I was in that wasn't locked. And I've been feeling I understand, like the ones on school property, so I kind of get it, but I felt a little weird about something that's in the community that isn't necessarily accessible to the community. And I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts on that.
We will not be locking ours. We are going to put up a gate only because we have roving dogs, and we've been cleaning up after them. But it would only be to keep them out. If somebody needs food and they come in and pick food, then they can have food. That's kind of that's our mentality. So I see no need to have a lock on the garden. Um, so that's just our take on it.
Yeah, that was kind of the way it was for the first one, partly because there wasn't a lot of green space to hang out in, and it was a place where the neighbors tended to respect it for the most part. But the two most recent ones, it's just always kind of.
I know the church that I'm talking to, they're talking about lighting.
Mm.
So they want to keep constant activity to get away from the drug deals. Go on. So it's very challenging, apparently. So that's one thing.
Yeah, we don't have lighting at any of ours, so at any of the ones I've been in. So I don't know what the answer would be there, as far as that goes.
You may want to try solar lights. If that's something, you can get them in long strings, or you can get individuals, and they will light up the garden enough each evening. I have them all around my house. They're really a neat ambiance. They add, and so people tend to respect that, that, oh, this looks really nice. So I'll respect that. So that might be an option.
That's a great idea too. Then you're also being responsible with the energy that you use while you're.
It doesn't cost anything except the purchase of the lights.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I know we're coming up on our hour, and I feel like we're gardeners, so we could probably talk all night if we wanted to, but I want to be respectful of your evenings and whatever else you have planned today. So I just want to take the time to thank each of the participants. I really enjoyed hearing the different perspectives and learning a ton from each of you, and just really want to show how much appreciation I have for you taking out time out of your lives to do this for us. And then I'll go ahead and close us in prayer. Dear God, thank you for this time. And I pray for everybody that's thinking about making a church garden. Just pray that you will be with them as they think about their community and their church and the way that they want to minister using your land. Thank you for this in advance. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, take care. Have a good one, everybody.